is public school worse or preferable than a heterodox school? What do you think?
When we say a heterodox school, I'm gonna take that to mean a Catholic or Protestant school. And I think any school has a temperament and has a culture within it. And so, I think I've known priests that are wonderful, very strong, good priests who, let's say, and I asked them, where did you go to school, K through 12? And they said, well, I went to a Catholic school. And also, how did that go? And they said, well, they were very, very respectful of me being Orthodox, right? They didn't put pressures on me, in direct ways. They respected my ability to disagree in theology courses, et cetera, et cetera. Other schools may not be that way. So I think when you're choosing a school in general, whether it's let's say a non-Orthodox Christian school or a public school, you've got to measure the temperament of what's happening there. I mean, there are, public schools, and even when we first came back from grad school, our children were in a public school, and the principal, she was a very strong person and very respectful of the families. And at that time and place, it worked for us. I mean, in particular, my wife had to work very hard to be on top of everything that was going on and happening. But the temperament of the school was such that we knew that the teachers were going to respect us and our children, and the principal was going to ensure that was going to happen. And so I just think you have to, everything becomes concrete and is no longer abstract when you're in a place and in a time, and you've got to look at those places and say, okay, let me ask myself, is this a place where I believe my child is going to be protected?
So I obviously, some of these things have to be applied in case by case, as you're saying, but maybe what we need to try to help them with is just give them a few criteria or principles how to make that decision. In other words,
the first one I would say is, if you go into a school, always visit a school in mid-April, right? And walk the hallways and see what's going on. And if the school is active and in good order and alive and living, and it hasn't been toppled by the year, then that there's good order there. So I think that, to me, that's always been a good rule of thumb is, if you walk down the hallways and the kids are out of control, or they're watching videos, or the teacher's got their head down at their desk, that is a school that is not thriving, right? So there's a concrete principle. As I always say, schools don't educate children, teachers do. So you really need to know who the teachers actually are. How do they, it's the same thing with university. People say, well, my kid's going in Texas A&M. Okay, well, great. Who's teaching them? I mean, it's the second, one of the largest schools in the country. People teach children, not institutions. And so you can gain a certain amount of trust in the institution based on its culture or claims, but you need to actually know who that person is in that room spending all that time with your child. And what do they believe? And what are they imparting to your children? So I think that's a second principle that I would put in place. And then the third is you can always look at the fruits, go figure out what the graduates are doing and what they're like. Try to find a space to talk to the graduates of the school, because that'll tell you, in part, exactly what that school is trying to shape and form. So I think
it's interesting. It's interesting. Some spiritual fathers, I have one in mind in Australia who talks a lot about this. He's very adamant. He speaks in his lectures and he says, do not send your children to non-Orthodox schools, heterodox schools. So he has the opinion that there's obviously a stated goal in that environment to form the children according to the image of and the idea of Christ that they have. And that at especially a young age, that's going to deform from the Orthodox perspective. It's going to make a deformation and almost an idol of Christ. It's not really Christ. They're not going to encounter Christ properly because of their heretical teachings. And so you're going to have to undo that in a way or later on. Of course, that's a generalization, and you said there are exceptions, and we can talk about it. But I think that's the general thrust of maybe the question, but certainly of this teacher that I have in mind is that when you don't have that, now that doesn't mean that the secular or public school is not doing the same thing. They've got a different vision, and they're pushing it as well, but not as marked, and not with regard to Christ. They might essentially be agnostic or indifferent to Christ, whereas here you have a Christ that's being presented that is not the vision of Christ in the church, and so it's much they're touching their hands on the sacred things, and then you have a pedagogical problem. Whereas if they never address in fact, you might even have a more vibrant child reacting against the spirit of the world and having to live in that and be tested and be, I'm thinking about high school mainly. Than if you had, I don't know. These are generalizations. You could say the same thing.
I think the challenge is it's a generalization, right? I mean, in other words, what is the temperament of the child? Does the child mold easily to their environments around them? What are the options in front of you if you require both parents to be working and there's a public school where there's massive amounts of drugs and violence and kids are getting beat up in the bathrooms every day, or you've got this school where there are kids that have some level of decency and some level of concern and kindness. I mean, so yeah, it's hard to get into that generalization, but I think to your point, there are things you can look for, and then you have to know your children and what they can handle and how big is the community. I mean, if you're in a small, rural community where everybody already, and there's only 2 Orthodox families there, your kids are mixing with those kids already every day, versus an urban.
So there's no substitute for discernment, basically.
Yeah,
there's no substitute.
I believe Evil says that Mrs. Discernment, right? It's the we joke in our home. It's the D word, right? It's the hard question.
Yeah. You can only do so much, and then you got to actually go and consult your spiritual father on a case by case basis.
It always becomes concrete very quickly.